There is a moment she returns to even now. Not the worst night, not the coldest morning, not the sound of rain hammering down on concrete at 2 in the morning, with nothing between her and the dark but a flashlight in her own two hands. She returns to a moment that came before any of that, a moment of pure stillness. She is standing inside a vaulted concrete room half underground in a city that does not know she exists. The ceiling curves above her like the inside of a cathedral 12 feet at its highest point, narrowing toward the walls in a long continuous arch. The floor beneath her boots is cold and dry. The air is close and mineral and old. There are no windows. The only light in the room is coming from a small electric lantern she is holding at her side, and the circle of yellow it throws catches the curve of the wall. The rough seam where two poured concrete panels meet the dark mouth of a staircase in the far corner leading down into water. She is 20 years old. She arrived in this city 6 weeks ago with $34 in a gym bag, and she is standing here in the silence of a room built for the end of the world thinking this is more than I need. That was the spring of 2019. Her name is Maya Reeves. She is going to spend the next 4 years inside this place. Before any of that, there was a bus. The Greyhound came into Tacoma on a Tuesday afternoon in May, rolling down Pacific Avenue through a drizzle so thin it barely registered on the windows, more mist than rain, the kind of weather that gets into your clothes without you noticing until your collar is already damp. Maya had the window seat in the second to last row. She had been on the bus for 4 hours from Spokane, and she had spent most of those 4 hours watching Eastern Washington turn into Western Washington, watching the flat, dry scrubland east of the Cascades give way to pine forest, and then to the wider, greener valley country that meant you were getting close to Puget Sound. She watched it the way she watched most things, carefully, without hurry, filing it in the back of her mind, where she kept information that might be useful later. She did not know yet how useful it would be. She had $22 left when she stepped off the bus. That was wrong. She had started with 34, which was everything she had after paying the bus ticket, and she had spent $12 in the Spokane terminal on a sandwich and 2 cups of coffee and a pair of cheap rain-resistant pants from a discount rack near the magazine stand because she knew Tacoma was wet and she was going to need them. The math had seemed right at the time. Standing on the sidewalk outside the Greyhound terminal on Pacific Avenue, with her gym bag over one shoulder and the mist settling on her hair and jacket, she ran the numbers again. $22. She was not panicking. She would tell people this later and some of them would not believe her. And she understood why they wouldn't, because $22 in an unfamiliar city at 20 years old sounds like the beginning of a panic. But Maya did not experience it that way. She experienced it as a problem with a very short timeline, and problems with short timelines required immediate clear thinking. Panicking used up time. She did not have time to waste. She stood there for a few minutes, not frozen, thinking. She looked north up Pacific Avenue, then south. She looked at the storefronts across the street, a payday loan place, a nail salon, a check-cashing window with bars on the glass. She looked at the people moving on the sidewalk and the traffic moving in the street, and the way the mist was thickening now, not quite rain, not quite fog. She cataloged all of it the way you catalog things when you have no margin to get them wrong. Then she put one foot in front of the other and started walking. The first thing she needed was shelter for the night. Not permanent, not complicated, just a ceiling and 4 walls and enough safety to sleep. She had done her research before she left Spokane in the public library on West Main Street on a computer terminal near the reference desk. She knew there was a 24-hour McDonald's on South Tacoma Way. She knew there was a warming shelter on Martin Luther King Jr. Way that opened at 6 in the evening. She knew the public library on Commerce Street opened at 9 in the morning and closed at 8 at night. These were her 3 anchors. She built the first week around them. The McDonald's came first. It was a 20-minute walk from the bus terminal. She arrived just before 5 in the afternoon when the dinner rush was beginning and the booths were starting to fill. She bought a small coffee for $1.39, which brought her down to $20.61. And she took the booth in the far corner, the one with her back to the wall and a clear sight line to both the front door and the side entrance near the restrooms. She set her gym bag on the floor between her feet, where she could feel it against her ankles. She drank the coffee slowly. She watched. There is a specific education that happens inside a 24-hour McDonald's if you are paying attention. Not the kind of education anybody plans to get, but real education nonetheless. In the space of a single evening, Maya began to understand the invisible structure of how the place worked. Which staff members were inclined to let things slide, and which ones moved through the dining room with their eyes down deliberately, not seeing what they didn't want to have to deal with. She watched a man in his 50s thick coat, heavy boots fall asleep in the booth across from her and stay there for 2 hours before anyone said anything, and the thing that was said was quiet and without confrontation. A cup of coffee appearing on the table in front of him, a murmured word, a nod. He drank it, he bought a small order of fries, he stayed. She noted the rhythm of it. The place had a rhythm, like all places do, a pattern of busy and quiet, of attention and inattention, and once you understood the pattern, you could move within it almost invisibly. This was Maya's first real skill, the one she had developed over 2 years of moving through spaces that were not designed for her, spaces that tolerated her presence at best. She had learned to read a room before she entered it. She had learned to find the edges where she would not be noticed, the gaps where nobody was looking. It was not a skill she had been taught. It was a skill she had built out of necessity, the way people build all their most useful skills. She slept that first night in 40-minute intervals, her chin dropping to her chest, and then snapping back up when a booth creaked or a door opened. Not real sleep, more like a controlled dimming the body, taking what it could get in the time available. She had done this before in other cities, in other late-night diners, in bus station lobbies, and her body had learned to accept it. In the morning, she bought another coffee. She used the restroom to wash her face and hands and change her shirt. She repacked her bag neatly and methodically because neatness mattered, because appearing composed was a form of protection she could give herself even when she had nothing else. The second night, the same. The third night, the same. By the third night, she had spent another $4.12 on food. She had $16.49 left. She had a sense of the neighborhood. She had found the food pantry on MLK Way, which opened at 10 in the morning 3 days a week, and she had been there twice. She had located the warming shelter, which was real, and where she had said it would be, but which was crowded in a way that felt difficult. Too many bodies in too small a space. Too much noise and movement and uncertainty. She had spent one evening there and then returned to the McDonald's, where the controlled dimness of the booth felt safer than the unpredictability of the shelter floor. And it was at the warming shelter on that one evening that she met Vera. Vera was 53 years old. She had been living outside and in informal structures in and around Tacoma for 8 years. She was not a small woman, wide shoulders, thick hands, a stillness about her that was different from resignation, more like the stillness of someone who had stopped flinching at things that used to make her flinch. She was sitting on a folding metal chair near the back wall of the shelter with a paper cup of coffee when Maya came in, and she looked at Maya the way experienced people look at newcomers, assessing without hostility, reading the bag, the boots, the posture, the particular way Maya was holding herself slightly apart from the room, calibrating. "First week," Vera said. Maya looked at her. "How can you tell some—" "You're watching exits," Vera said. "People who've been here a while stop doing that. They already know where the exits are." Maya sat down in the chair beside her. Not because she was invited exactly, but because Vera had not looked away, and looking away would have been a performance of indifference that Maya did not have the energy for. They talked for 2 hours, not about trauma, not about how either of them had gotten there. Those were not conversations that needed to happen that night, and both of them knew it. They talked about practical things. Vera told her which dumpsters behind which businesses got restocked on which days. She told her which blocks the city sweep teams targeted in what rotation. She told her about the markdown schedules at the Safeway on 6th Avenue and the church on Commerce Street that did a Saturday meal and the day labor connection at the food pantry. And then near the end of the evening, she told her 3 things that she said were the most important things she had learned in 8 years. "The floor," Vera said. "That's where you lose the heat, not the walls. People think it's the walls, but the ground pulls heat out of you faster than any wall ever will. Sleeping bag blanket doesn't matter. If you're lying on a cold surface, you will keep getting colder because the cold is coming up through everything you put between yourself and the ground. You have to get off the floor." Maya listened without interrupting. "Wet," Vera said. "Wet is what kills, not cold. 40 degrees and dry you can manage. 40 degrees and soaked, you are in trouble fast. Insulation stops working when it's saturated. Fabric stops working. Everything stops working. So you keep dry clothes dry. You keep wet clothes away from dry clothes. You treat that separation like it is more important than anything else you own, because it is. Maya nodded. And you eat, Vera said. You eat enough. I know that sounds easy, and it isn't. When your body is working to keep your temperature up in a cold place, it burns a lot. More than you think. And if you don't feed it enough, you will feel colder than the person standing next to you in the exact same weather just because you skipped dinner. I have seen people go hypothermic in conditions they should have been fine in. And when I looked at what they'd eaten that day, the answer was nothing. Or close to nothing. She looked at Maya directly when she said the last part. You eat, she said again. Whatever else happens, you eat. Maya remembered all three of those things. Not in the way you remember something someone told you once, in the way you remember something that you verified over and over in real conditions until it became the kind of knowledge you no longer have to think about because it has become part of how you move through the world. She left the shelter that night and went back to the McDonald's booth. She bought a coffee. She sat with her back to the wall. She thought about what Vera had said about the floor, and she thought about what it would mean to have a floor that wasn't concrete or cold ground. A floor she controlled, a floor she could put something between herself and... She had been thinking since she arrived in Tacoma about what came next, what step 2 looked like beyond the immediate problem of each night. But that night, thinking about floors, the thinking started to get more specific. On the 4th day, she walked east. She was looking for somewhere that Vera had mentioned, a warming facility that Vera said was less crowded than the main shelter, somewhere in the blocks east of Pacific, toward the rail yard, and the industrial corridor that backed up against the port. She had a rough direction and no address, which was fine. Walking in a rough direction and paying close attention to what you found was how Maya operated in unfamiliar territory. You didn't need an exact destination if you were watching carefully enough. She walked through a neighborhood of low industrial buildings, shuttered loading docks, a salvage yard behind tall fencing with razor wire at the top. She walked past a building that might have been a warehouse once and now had most of its windows boarded. She crossed a set of train tracks on a road that was more pothole than pavement. The mist had cleared and the morning was cold and clear, and off to the west she could see the water of the port glinting silver between the buildings. She walked for 40 minutes before she admitted she was not going to find the facility today, and started thinking instead about just learning this part of the city, mapping it the way she had mapped the blocks around the McDonald's and the food pantry. That was when she saw it. She almost walked past. It was the kind of thing that did not announce itself, that existed on the other side of a threshold of attention most people did not cross because most people were not looking for it. It was behind a chain-link fence at the far back corner of a vacant lot between a shuttered building and a car parts business that, based on the hours posted on the door, she could read from the street only opened on Thursdays. The fence had a gap where a post had rusted loose at the base and tilted out from the concrete footing, creating a triangle of open space about 18 inches wide and 3 feet tall. Not large, but navigable. What was behind the fence was not obvious from the sidewalk, because whatever it was had been there long enough for the vegetation around it to reshape itself entirely around its presence. A dense mass of blackberry canes and sword fern and Himalayan laurel that had been growing for years had colonized the back corner of the lot, thickening into an almost impenetrable wall of green from the fence to the back property line. But something was wrong with the shape of the vegetation. There was a mound behind it that was too regular to be natural, too consistent in its curvature, too clearly the product of a single organizing intention, rather than the random accumulation of earth and debris. The mound was about 15 feet across, and it rose from the ground maybe 4 feet at its highest point before the vegetation obscured the rest. It was rounded at the top. It looked like a hill that had been placed there rather than grown. Maya stopped walking. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a long moment. The regularity of it, the deliberateness of that curve. She looked at the vegetation around it, and she noticed that the blackberry canes, though dense, were growing around something, conforming to something, the way vines and canes always grow around an object rather than through it. She looked at the way the ground sloped toward the mound rather than away from it, which was unusual, which suggested the mound had been built rather than worn down. She took 3 steps toward the fence. Through the gap in the vegetation at the base of the mound, she could see the edge of something gray. Not dirt gray, not rock gray, manufactured gray. The gray of poured concrete. She did not go through the fence. Not that day. She stood there for a while longer, looking through the chain link at the gap in the vegetation at that edge of concrete. Then she turned around and walked back to the McDonald's. She bought a coffee. She sat in her booth, she thought. She went back the next morning early before 7 when the light was flat and thin, and there was no one on that stretch of street. She stood at the fence and looked through it at the lot and tried to see more. The mound was easier to read in the morning light without the harsh shadows that the afternoon sun threw. She could see now that the concrete she had glimpsed the day before was not just an edge. It was a wall, a curved wall rising from the ground and arching overhead. Not a retaining wall, not a foundation remnant, a continuous structure, something built in the round. She went back in the evening. She went back 3 times the next day at different hours. Nobody came to the lot. Nobody came from the car parts place on the other side. Nobody came from the shuttered building on the other side. No vehicles stopped. No workers appeared. The lot was completely, absolutely still. On the 5th day, she went through the fence gap. She moved carefully. She pushed through the blackberry canes at the edge of the gap, feeling the thorns catch at her jacket, pulling her sleeve free with patience rather than force. She crossed the lot on a diagonal toward the mound, stepping over broken asphalt and weeds, and what might have been an old foundation pad half buried in the ground. The air in the lot was different from the street, quieter, more contained the way urban lots get when they've been empty long enough to develop their own small ecosystem. She came around the curve of the mound on the south side and stopped. The structure was larger than it had looked from the fence. The mound that had seemed maybe 15 feet across was more like 20, the curve of it, more dramatic than she'd understood, rising nearly 6 feet from the base before the sod and vegetation at the top obscured the rest. And built into the face of it, set back into the slope like a door in a hillside, was a blast door. It was steel. It was 4 feet wide and perhaps 6 feet tall, set into a concrete frame that had been poured directly into the face of the structure. The steel was red with surface rust across most of its face, but the rust was cosmetic, the kind that forms on the surface without eating through the metal. And underneath it, you could see the original paint still holding in patches dark green, military green. The hinges were massive, the kind used on structures designed to withstand serious pressure. There were 2 locking mechanisms, a conventional handle with a deadbolt above it, and below that a second mechanism, a wheel lock like the kind used on bank vault doors, though smaller single-handed. Both mechanisms were locked. A length of chain had been run through the wheel and padlocked, but the padlock was consumer grade, the kind you could buy at any hardware store, and it looked entirely out of place against the engineering of everything around it. Beside the door, bolted into the concrete frame at eye level, was a metal plate. Rectangular, perhaps 8 inches by 4. The bolts had bled rust down the face of the concrete in long brown streaks. The text on the plate was stamped into the metal and painted black, but the paint had held better in the recesses of the letters than on the surface, and she could read it clearly even with the afternoon light coming at an angle. Tacoma Civil Defense Authorized Personnel Only Established, 1962. She read it twice. She stood in front of that door for what felt like a long time, though she could not have said how long. She was aware of the weight of the concrete structure rising above her, the sod and fern and blackberry that covered it, the city street 20 yards behind her, the absolute silence of the lot. She was aware of the size of what she was standing in front of, not just physically, but historically, what it meant that a door like this existed, what it meant that a structure like this had been built here in this city in 1962, when the thing people were afraid of was different from anything she could fully imagine. She thought someone built this for people to survive in. Then she turned around and walked back through the fence gap and out to the sidewalk and kept walking. She had things to do. She had a food pantry visit, and she needed to see Vera at the shelter if Vera was there, and she needed to think. Thinking was work. It required the same discipline as everything else she did, the same patient, methodical attention. She was not going to act on what she had found until she understood it better. She gave herself 11 days. 11 days, because that was how long it took her to be certain. She watched the lot from the sidewalk every morning between 7 and 9, and every evening around 5. She watched from different positions on the street, from across the road, from the alley opening, 50 yards north, from the parking lot of a closed tire business on the far corner. She was watching for patterns of access for anyone who came or went, for vehicles that stopped for city workers, or maintenance crews, or property managers, or anyone at all who had any relationship to that lot and what was inside it. Nobody came. Not once. Not a single person in 11 days approached that fence, looked at that lot, showed any awareness that the mound in the back corner existed. The car parts place next door opened on Thursdays, and a single man, middle-aged, heavyset, came and opened the roll-up door and went inside and closed the door behind him and did not look toward the lot at all. The shuttered building on the other side showed no activity. The street traffic on the block was thin and purposeful, people going somewhere specific, not lingering, not looking. The lot was a blank spot in the attention of the neighborhood. It had been there long enough and been quiet long enough that people had simply stopped registering it. During those 11 days, she also looked at the door. She looked at it more carefully on the second and fourth and seventh days, going through the fence gap and walking up close enough to study the locking mechanisms without touching anything. The padlock on the chain through the wheel lock was a combination lock, a basic one, the kind that opened on a 3-number sequence. And on the back of the padlock, she could see, when she leaned close enough in the morning light, the edge of something. A piece of tape. Old tape, yellowed, adhered to the back of the padlock for so long it had partially fused to the metal. She leaned closer. There were numbers written on the tape in permanent marker, faded but legible, 7/1943. Someone had taped this combination to the back of the padlock because they kept forgetting it. She did not touch it. Not yet. She straightened up and stepped back and looked at the door again. All of it, the rust and the paint and the massive hinges and the civil defense plate with its 1962 stamp. And then she walked back out through the fence gap and went to the food pantry for lunch. On the 12th day, she went through the fence gap with her gym bag over her shoulder, and she walked up to the blast door and she took the padlock in her hand and turned it over and read the numbers on the tape. She worked the combination slowly. 7/1943. The shackle released. She threaded the chain free of the wheel and set the chain and padlock down on the ground beside the door. The wheel lock took muscle. It had not been turned in a long time, and the mechanism was stiff with corrosion at the joints, but it was not seized. It moved when she applied steady pressure, grinding slightly as the bolts pulled back. She felt the deadbolt mechanism release. She put her hand on the handle. She pulled. The door moved, not easily. The hinges had stiffened and the mass of the steel resisted, and she had to plant her feet and use her whole body. But it moved. It swung outward on its arc, slowly, the rust on the exterior face, catching the morning light as it turned, a low groan coming from the hinges. That was not a screech, but a sustained complaint. The sound of something being asked to do a thing it had not been asked to do in a very long time. She pulled it open to about 30 degrees and stopped. The opening was wide enough for her to pass through. She looked in. The interior was dark, completely dark, no natural light source. She took the flashlight from the front pocket of her gym bag and switched it on and stepped through the doorway. The smell hit her first. Not unpleasant exactly, but extremely specific. Mineral and dry, and contained the smell of poured concrete that has been sealed against the outside air for decades, a smell like stone and old paper and something faintly metallic that she could not identify. The air itself was cooler than the outside air by a significant margin. Still, not moving at all. She swept the flashlight beam slowly from left to right. The room was large. She had imagined a shed, a room roughly comparable to what she'd been picturing when she thought about enclosed structures, small and manageable. What she was standing in was something else entirely. The ceiling above her was an arch, a true vault, rising from the walls in a continuous curve that peaked at what she estimated was 12 feet above the floor. The floor itself was poured concrete, smooth and dry, and the room was circular, or very nearly so, the walls following the curve of the exterior mound. She began pacing the diameter and counted it out at roughly 20 feet, which meant she was standing in a room of close to 380 square feet, not counting whatever was in the far corner. In the far corner, there was a staircase. It was metal industrial, bolted into the concrete wall, descending at a steep angle into a lower level. She moved the flashlight beam toward it and walked to the top of the stairs and looked down. Below the stairs, the beam of her flashlight caught the surface of still black water. The lower level was flooded. She could see the tops of metal shelving units breaking the surface. The edges of equipment she could not identify the corner of what might have been a desk or a workbench. The water was very still. It reflected her flashlight beam back up at her in a flat, glassy surface that told her nothing about the depth. She could not see the floor. She stood at the top of the stairs for a moment. Then she stepped back and turned the flashlight beam back toward the main room. The upper level, the ceiling with its long vault, and the walls with their smooth concrete faces, and the floor that was dry and solid beneath her boots. She walked to the center of the room. She stood there. The flashlight threw a hard circle of light against the far wall, and her shadow stretched back toward the door behind her, long and dark. The silence in the room was different from the silence outside. Outside there was always something. Wind, traffic, birds. Even in the early morning sound moved through space. In here the concrete walls were thick enough and the seal of the door complete enough that the outside world had been reduced to nothing. The only thing she could hear was her own breathing, and very faintly the sound of water settling somewhere below her. She was not frightened. She stood there in the center of the room in the dark, in the silence, in the cold mineral air that had been sitting in this place sealed and still while the city went on outside. She stood there and she thought about the problem. She thought about the floor, about Vera's first rule. The concrete was cold, but it was dry, and cold, dry concrete was a solvable problem if you had time and materials. She thought about the walls, smooth concrete, no gaps, no drafts. A completely different problem from wood siding, but arguably a simpler one in some ways, because concrete did not rot and did not flex in the wind. She thought about the ceiling, the beautiful long curve of it above her, and the fact that what was above it was not open sky, but 4 feet of packed earth and sod and vegetation, which was the best insulation any roof could have. She thought about the door, which sealed completely, which meant wind was not a factor, and water intrusion would only come from below. She thought about the lower level, the flooded room below the stairs. She did not know how deep it was or what was in it or why it had flooded or whether the water was still rising. That was a problem she did not yet have the information to solve, so she set it aside in the part of her mind where she kept problems that were real but not urgent problems she would return to when she had more data. She turned the flashlight beam slowly around the circumference of the room one more time. Metal shelving collapsed on one side. A panel of switches and dials on the wall near the door dark and dusty. A rusted hook bolted to the wall at shoulder height. Spider silk catching the beam at the edges of the ceiling where it met the walls. And in one section of the floor in the far quadrant, away from the stairs, a faint discoloration in the concrete that suggested the floor had once been painted a long time ago in a color she could not determine in the white beam. She exhaled. This, she said to no one in the dark in the silence of that sealed and ancient room, is more than I need. She was not speaking about the size of it, or not only about the size. She was speaking about what it meant to be standing in a structure that had been built to the specifications of survival. A structure designed by engineers who had thought carefully about what human beings needed to stay alive in the worst possible circumstances. The floor was sealed concrete. The walls were poured thick. The roof was earth itself. The door was steel designed to withstand pressure forces that most buildings would not survive. Someone 60 years before Maya Reeves stepped off a Greyhound bus with $34 in her pocket had sat down at a drafting table and made precise and serious decisions about how to keep people alive in a very dangerous world. And those decisions were what she was standing inside right now. She did not know yet about the maddening patience it would take to claw warmth out of that concrete. She did not know about the 11 months it would take to properly insulate the walls, or the specific problem the sealed space would create in terms of air quality, or the flooding that would come up through the floor cracks in November, when the water table rose, or the sound of rain on the earth above the vault. That was nothing like rain on a roof, a low drum that you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. She did not know about any of the things the next 4 years would teach her. What she knew, standing in that circle of flashlight in the sealed room under the earth, was that she was 20 years old and she had $34 in a gym bag, and she had just found the most solid thing she had ever stood inside of. She pulled the door closed behind her when she left. She threaded the chain through the wheel lock and set the combination back to 7/1943 and pressed the shackle closed. She walked across the lot and through the gap in the chain link fence and out onto the sidewalk. The morning was still early. The street was still quiet. A seagull crossed above the rooftops, headed toward the port. She walked to the food pantry on MLK Way and got in line for breakfast. She ate everything they gave her. She drank 2 cups of coffee. She thought about the floor. Then she started planning. She gave herself 2 weeks before she moved anything in. Not because she needed 2 weeks, because she needed to know that the decision was right before she committed to it. And the only way she knew to test a decision was to live with it long enough that the edges of it showed. She had made bad decisions before in Spokane, in the year before Spokane, in the general slow drift of 2 years after the foster system released her at 18, with a paper bag of her belongings and a list of resources that were either underfunded or oversubscribed or both. She had learned to distrust the feeling of certainty that came too quickly. The things that felt obviously right in the first 24 hours were sometimes right and sometimes the beginning of a very long problem. She waited. She thought about the floor every day. Vera had been clear about it. The floor was where the cold came from. The concrete in the bunker was going to pull heat out of anyone sleeping on it, regardless of what they piled on top, because the thermal mass of a concrete slab in close contact with damp-packed earth pulled heat upward constantly, conducting it through everything. She needed to break that contact. She needed a layer of dead air between her body and the concrete. She needed materials, and she had no money to buy them. She began mapping the dumpsters within a 12-block radius of the lot. Not randomly, methodically. She identified the commercial and industrial dumpsters versus the residential ones, and focused on commercial because commercial dumpsters near construction and renovation sites produce the most useful discarded material. She identified the dump schedules by watching which days the trucks came. She found in the alley behind a tile supply warehouse 3 blocks from the lot a dumpster that was being filled with broken and cracked ceramic tile irregular pieces that had cracked during shipping or storage and could not be used for their intended purpose. She found behind a building being renovated on the other side of the industrial corridor a pile of cardboard boxes that had been broken down and stacked for recycling, dense layers of double-walled corrugated cardboard. She found in a construction dumpster near the rail yard 4 sheets of rigid foam board insulation. The pink kind, 2 inches thick, each sheet 4 feet by 8. Someone had cut them down and decided they were no longer useful. To Maya, they were the most valuable things she had found in Tacoma since the bunker itself. She carried the foam sheets 2 at a time, walking the 6 blocks back to the lot with a sheet balanced across each arm, her forearms spread to take the width of them, the sheets catching the wind off the port and swaying gently. She looked, she would admit later, completely ridiculous. She made 2 trips. On a morning in late June 2019, 6 weeks after she had stepped off the Greyhound bus on Pacific Avenue, Maya Reeves carried the last load of tile pieces into the lot and through the fence gap and across to the blast door. She unlocked the door and pulled it open and propped it with a wedge of broken concrete she had found in the lot. She spread the first pieces of broken tile on the concrete floor of the bunker and began fitting them together like a puzzle. Irregular edges against irregular edges, finding the fits that minimized the gaps between them, building a surface over the cold slab 1 piece at a time. It took her the rest of the summer. Not continuously, in pieces early morning before the street got active. She worked until she heard sounds from the street, and then she stopped and packed everything neatly against the wall and pulled the door closed. She grout the tile gaps with a partial bag of dried grout mix she had found in the same construction dumpster, as the foam still workable in the center despite having hardened at the edges. She mixed it in a paint can with a small amount of water. She pressed it into the gaps with a piece of scrap wood she had cut to a wedge shape. She was not a tile layer. The results were imperfect. The surface was uneven and the grout lines were irregular, and some of the pieces sat at slightly different heights from their neighbors. But it was not concrete anymore. It was not a cold slab pulling heat through everything. It was a surface with texture and variation, and crucially with air gaps beneath the raised edges of the tile pieces, small pockets of still air caught between the broken ceramic and the concrete below. Dead air. the worst conductor of cold in the world. Free. She stood in the center of the room after the last piece was laid and looked at what she had done. The circle of tile spread out from her feet, catching the light from the flashlight propped against the wall, its surface rough and real and made entirely of things that other people had decided were useless. She was going to be all right. She did not know yet how many things she was going to have to learn before that was fully true. She did not know about the night still ahead, the things November was going to teach her that June had no way of teaching. She did not know about the mold she would find behind the cardboard on the north wall in March, or the way the wind off Puget Sound had a specific quality in January that was different from any cold she had felt before. She did not know about the mop bucket she would press into service as a collection vessel during the first real flooding, or the hours she would spend alone in the dark with a flashlight in her mouth and her hands in cold water, working a problem with no audience and no applause and no one to tell her she was doing it right. She knew the floor was done. She had started with the most important thing the way Vera had told her to, and the most important thing was finished. That was enough for now. That was exactly enough. The walls came next. Maya understood the problem clearly by mid-July 2019, after 2 weeks of sleeping in the bunker on the yoga mat and the platform she had built from pallet boards. 3 boards wide across 2 runners, raising herself 4 inches above the tile. Above the tile, above the concrete, the insulating layers stacking up the way Vera had described them. The platform worked, the tile worked, the floor was solved, or solved enough that she was not losing heat through the ground anymore, and the difference was measurable in the way her body felt when she woke up, less depleted, less like something had been slowly drawn out of her while she slept. The floor was solved. But the walls. Concrete holds cold differently from wood. Wood is a poor conductor, which means a wooden wall with gaps and drafts is cold because of the gaps and drafts, because the outside air moves through the wood fiber at the joints and seams. Concrete has no gaps. Concrete is continuous and seamless and dense. And its problem is not that the outside air moves through it, but that the material itself conducts temperature. A concrete wall in contact with the cold earth on its exterior face is a cold wall on its interior face, fully and completely, and without variation, a perfect transfer surface. You could press your palm flat against the interior wall of the bunker in the middle of summer and feel the cold coming back at you steadily, patiently, like something that had been waiting there all along. She needed to break that contact. She needed to put something between herself and the concrete that stopped the transfer, that created a barrier the cold could not conduct through. She already had cardboard, and she already had the pink foam board she had carried in 2 trips from the construction dumpster near the rail yard. The question was order and method. She started with the cardboard. Double-walled corrugated cardboard layered thick 3 and 4 sheets, deep cut and fitted to the curves of the wall. She fastened it with a hand stapler she found at the Goodwill on Pacific Avenue for $2, and it was slow work because the stapler was weak and the concrete offered no purchase, and she had to improvise backing pieces from the thicker cardboard sections to give the staple something to grip. She worked in the early mornings when the light was still low and the street outside was quiet. She cut the cardboard with a box cutter she found in the lot near the fence, still serviceable under its rust. She covered the north wall and the east wall and the curved section of south wall that ran from the door around to the staircase opening. Then the foam went on top of the cardboard. She used construction adhesive for the foam, a partial tube she had found in the same dumpster as the foam itself, and the adhesive went on in strips pressed against the cardboard surface. The foam sheet pressed flat against it and held for a count of 60 before she moved to the next section. The foam cut cleanly with the serrated bread knife she had bought at Goodwill for 50 cents, the edge dragging through the pink material with a sound like a long, slow exhale. She fitted the pieces together as tightly as she could and taped the joints with aluminum HVAC tape, the same wide silver tape she would later use on the exterior, bought in a short roll from the hardware store, before she had saved much of anything. The result was not beautiful. The interior face of the bunker walls was now a patchwork of pink foam board in varying widths and heights. Some sections flush, some slightly proud, the tape joints bright and industrial, the whole thing looking more like the inside of a refrigerated shipping container than a room where anyone lived. She stood back and looked at it. Then she pressed her palm against the foam surface. The cold was gone. Not entirely. Not the deep cold she knew was still there and the concrete behind it unchanged and patient. But between her hand and that cold, there was now a barrier that refused to conduct, that held the still air trapped between its cells and let nothing through. She could feel the difference. The foam was not warm, but it was not cold either. It was simply the absence of cold, which in the context of everything she was working on, was exactly the same as warmth. She built the partition wall in October. She had been watching the tile warehouse 2 blocks east for weeks, noticing the schedule of the company that came on Tuesdays to pull material from the front section of the building. They were clearing it methodically section by section from the front, and they had not yet reached the back of the property where a pile of wooden pallet boards had accumulated along the rear wall, left over from years of tile shipments. She began taking boards on Tuesday afternoons, after the company had loaded and gone one or two at a time, tucked under her arm or balanced across her shoulder, walking the 2 blocks back to the lot, with the boards carried low and her pace even and unhurried. Over 4 weeks, she took 14 boards. She pulled the nails from the pallet boards and straightened them on the tile floor with a piece of rebar she had found in the corner of the lot, using the concrete wall as a backing surface, and tapping the bent nails straight with a short piece of steel pipe. It was slow work. She bent 7 nails for every one she got right at first, and then she got faster, learning the angle of strike that worked the amount of force required until she could straighten a nail in 6 or 8 taps, and it would go into wood almost as cleanly as a new one. She saved every nail she straightened in a tin can from the food pantry. The partition frame went up on a Saturday afternoon in the second week of October. She nailed the uprights to a base plate and a top plate, the joints reinforced with diagonal pieces where the wood was strong enough. She built it 6.5 feet high rather than floor to ceiling, leaving an 18-inch gap at the top for air circulation because a completely sealed partition would have created a dead pocket of air that could not circulate and would get dangerously stale. The partition divided the bunker's upper level into roughly 2 sections: the larger main room of about 240 square feet, where she slept and kept her things, and a smaller back section of around 140 square feet that became storage tools, the reserved tile pieces, the cardboard she had not used. She covered the partition frame with the remaining cardboard and the last section of foam board. The bunker, which had been a single circular room smelling of old concrete and dust, and the mineral cold of sealed air, now had a room inside it. Not a large room, not a finished room in any sense that the word normally implied, but a defined space with walls on 4 sides and a ceiling above and a floor of mismatched ceramic tile below. And when she stood in the center of it, with the flashlight switched off and her eyes closed, she could feel the stillness of it around her. The specific quality of a space that was bounded, that had edges, that was separate from everything outside it. She built the sleeping platform higher in October, extending it and reinforcing it with the last of the pallet boards. She added the yoga mat on top and unrolled the sleeping bag on top of the mat. She had acquired 2 wool blankets from the church donation event on Commerce Street, and she layered them inside the sleeping bag, which was a medium-weight bag she had gotten at a church sale in August for $4. She was ready for November. She was not ready for November. She knew this in retrospect, and she would have known it at the time if she had known what November in Tacoma was actually going to be. Rather than the version of November she had been imagining, which was cold and wet, but manageable, which was the problem with imagining conditions you have not yet experienced. November in Tacoma, when it decides to be serious, is not the gray drizzle that fills most people's mental image of the Pacific Northwest. It is something more deliberate than that. It comes in from the sound in the early morning, the wind finding every gap in the geography of the industrial waterfront and pushing through it with intention, carrying rain that falls sideways before it falls down, that hits exposed surfaces at an angle, rather than from above, that gets into the seam between your jacket hood and your collar before you have time to adjust. The rain is not the main event. The main event is the cold that comes in underneath the rain, wet cold, the kind that settles into fabric and stays. The bunker held the rain. The bunker held it completely, which surprised her in a good way, because the earth above the vault was a better water barrier than any roof she could have built, and the concrete walls that were poured continuous and seamless had no joints for water to find. She lay in her sleeping bag on the platform on the first big storm night in mid-November and listened to the rain on the earth above her, that low drum that was less heard than felt, and the bunker was dry around her, and the foam-faced walls were holding the chill at bay, and she thought, I have done something right here. Then at some point in the early hours of the second big storm 2 weeks into November, she felt the wet. Not from above, from below. She woke up and something was wrong with the sound. The silence in the bunker had a different quality. A small sound where there should have been nothing. A sound like the very slow movement of water, like a thin stream finding its way across a flat surface. She switched on the flashlight and looked at the floor. The tile nearest the staircase opening was wet. A thin film of water was spreading outward from the base of the staircase wall, moving slowly across the tile surface, finding the low points in the grout lines and running along them. The lower level was flooding. Whatever was holding the water down there was not holding anymore, and the water was finding its way up through the base of the staircase wall, where the concrete joined the floor slab, pushing through the joint, the way groundwater always finds joints under pressure. She got up. She got the camp pot from the shelf she had built into the partition wall, and she carried it to the staircase and looked down. The water level below had risen. She could see it now 3 or 4 inches above where it had been when she last checked the surface, dark and still. She could not see how fast it was rising, but the water on the floor told her it was rising fast enough to push through the floor joint, which meant it was under some pressure, which meant there was more water coming. She spent the next 3 hours bailing. She could not bail the lower level. The lower level was beyond her, too much water, too deep, too dark. What she could do was manage the water on the upper floor, keep it from spreading to the section of the room where the sleeping platform was, keep it from soaking through to the cardboard insulation on the walls. She worked with the camp pot and the paint can and a section of rubber hose she had kept from the salvage yard, bailing the water that pushed through the joint and carrying it to the blast door and pouring it out onto the ground outside, walking back and forth across the tile in the dark with the flashlight tucked between her cheek and her shoulder. Hands, wet feet, wet inside her boots. The water slowed around 2 in the morning. The pressure below must have equalized, or the rain above had paused long enough for the water table to stop rising, because the thin film stopped advancing and the flow through the joint slowed to a drip and then to nothing. She stood in the middle of the tile floor with the camp pot in her hand and the flashlight illuminating a room that was wet in a long half circle near the stairs, but dry everywhere else, the platform dry, the walls dry, the sleeping bag untouched. She set the pot down. She switched the flashlight off. She stood in the dark for a while. This is the thing she would return to later when she tried to explain what that winter was actually like when someone asked her about the hardest part. Not the wet floor, not the cold, not the bailing or the hours of work or the water in her boots. The hardest part was the specific quality of the silence in that room after she switched the flashlight off. The complete and total dark. The absence of any sound from outside the concrete and the earth above absorbing everything, no wind, no rain, no traffic. And the understanding coming in slowly the way certain understandings do, the kind that have been present at the edges of your awareness for some time, and that you have been working around without quite confronting that there was no one coming. Not because no one cared. She did not think about it in terms of caring. She thought about it in practical terms. There was no one who knew she was here. There was no one who knew this address or this structure or this particular corner of this particular lot. If the water had kept rising, if the lower level had continued to push up, and the floor joint had failed and the upper level had flooded, there was no one who would have noticed until the water was very high. If she had been hurt, if she had fallen on the wet tile in the dark, there was no one who would have come by morning. She was operating in a space of complete invisibility, which was exactly what she had wanted and exactly what had made the place safe, and standing in the dark at 2 in the morning with wet feet and a camp pot in her hand, she felt the weight of that invisibility in a way she had not felt it before. She did not cry. She was not the kind of person who cried easily, and she knew it about herself, and she did not judge it. What she did instead was stand there and let the feeling have its full shape. She let it be what it was, which was loneliness of a very specific kind. Not the loneliness of missing people, not the loneliness of being unloved, but the loneliness of being completely outside the structure of the world that noticed things. The network of people and addresses and phone numbers and emergency contacts that existed for most people as something so ambient they never thought about it. She stood there and let it be true. Then she set the camp pot on the shelf and found a rag and dried off her boots the best she could and lay down on the platform on top of the sleeping bag and pulled the wool blankets up over her and stared at the ceiling. She could not see and made a decision, which was not really a decision because the decision had already been made the day she pulled the blast door open and walked inside. But there was a difference between a decision that you made and a decision that you chose again after knowing what it actually cost, and she was choosing it again in the dark, in the wet alone. And that choosing felt important in a way she could not have articulated, but that she knew was real. She was staying. She made it to March. The first winter was not easy, and she did not pretend it was easy, not to herself and not later when she talked about it. The insulation she had built into the walls helped but did not solve. The sleeping platform helped but did not solve. The wool blankets helped. What helped most ultimately was everything Vera had told her and the degree to which she followed those 3 rules without exception. The floor, she never slept on the floor, not once. Even when she was so tired she could have lain down on the tile and been unconscious in 30 seconds, she climbed onto the platform. Every night, without exception. The wet, she kept a hook, a bent nail pounded into the partition wall just inside the blast door, where every wet thing she wore came off the moment she came inside. Jacket always, boots always, wet gloves, wet hat, the rain gear she had by November, a poncho from the Goodwill. Everything wet stopped at the hook. The inside of the bunker was the dry zone, and she maintained the boundary between wet and dry with a rigidity that felt almost ceremonial. Because Vera had said that the line between wet and dry was a line between survival and trouble, and Maya believed her. The food, she used the pantry on MLK Way twice a week. She used the church meal on Saturday. She learned the markdown rhythm at the Safeway, which produce went to half price at what hour on what day. She supplemented with the McDonald's when she had a little money. She ate enough, every night, even on the nights when the pantry had been sparse and the church meal had been thin and the Safeway markdown had not materialized. She found something, she always found something, and she ate it. She went to bed on enough calories every night of that first winter. She was hungry sometimes, not dangerously, and she was cold in the bunker, but never in the way that scared her. She made it to March, and March came in mild, and she sat on the concrete rim of the mound one afternoon in early spring when the blackberry canes were starting to put out new shoots and the air smelled of rain and something that might have been moss. And she thought about what she had just done, which was survive a Tacoma winter in a civil defense bunker she found for free. And the thought was not triumphant exactly, but it had a weight to it, a solidity, the feeling of something that had been tested and had held. She found work in the spring. The contact came through the food pantry through a woman who coordinated between the pantry and the day labor network, a system of informal connections rather than formal employment work that appeared through word of mouth and paid in cash. Maya worked through the summer of 2020, not every day, some weeks, 3 days, some weeks 5, carrying materials on construction sites and cleaning out properties being turned over between tenants and loading trucks at the warehouse district, and doing whatever was offered that she could do with her body and her attention to detail, which turned out to be many things. She was reliable, which mattered more than skill in most of the contexts where she worked. She showed up when she said she would show up. She did not complain. She did not disappear. These qualities, which seemed to her like the minimum requirements of simply being a person, were apparently less common than she had expected, because the work kept coming and the cash kept accumulating. By late fall 2020, she had saved $212. She had a list. She had been building the list for months since the winter before, since the night of the flooding and the bailing in the dark. The list was specific and ordered by priority, which meant by impact on survival margin, not by what she wanted, but by what would make the most difference to her ability to get through the next winter in better condition than the last one. She had learned in the first winter what the gaps were. She knew exactly what had been hardest, and she knew what would close those gaps. The list was 6 items long. She worked through it in order. The first thing she bought was the heater. She found it on a community marketplace app on the library computer, a propane camp heater that ran on 1-pound canisters and had a low oxygen shutoff that cut the flame automatically if the combustion used too much of the available oxygen in the space. This last feature was not a nice to have. In a sealed concrete room with limited ventilation, running a combustion appliance without an oxygen shutoff was how people died in their sleep. And she had spent 2 hours on the library computer before she bought anything, reading about combustion chemistry and confined space safety and exactly how the shutoff mechanism worked. She paid $55 for the heater from a man in the north end of the city who was clearing out a storage unit. She brought it back to the bunker and cracked the blast door 2 inches before she ran it for the first time, testing it for 30 minutes, with the shutoff indicator visible, watching the light stay green. The second thing was a sleeping bag. A second one also used from the Goodwill on Pacific Avenue, $14. She nested them. Outer bag first, then the inner bag inside it, her body inside that, the wool blankets on top of everything. The first night she slept in the nested bags, she understood what warmth actually felt like in a cold space. The specific warmth that comes from true insulation, from dead air trapped in multiple overlapping layers around a single heat source, which was her own body. She woke up in the morning, and the air in the bunker was cold, and her breath was misting. And the tile floor she could see past the edge of the platform was absolutely frigid. But she was warm. Genuinely deeply warm. It was a different experience from surviving the cold. It was the experience of being protected from it. The third thing was the lantern. She bought it from a liquidation store on South Tacoma Way, $18, a battery-powered LED unit with a folding handle and a diffuser panel that spread the light in a wide circle rather than throwing a directed beam. She had been using a flashlight for 17 months. A flashlight gave her a tool. The lantern gave her something she had not anticipated and could not have described in advance. She set it on the shelf above the sleeping platform and switched it on the first night. The light went everywhere. It found the curve of the ceiling, the long vault of concrete above her, and spread across it evenly. No hard shadows, no dark edges. The whole interior face of the arch illuminated in warm amber. It found the patchwork of foam board on the walls and turned the industrial pink to something softer. Something that looked in that light almost like color. It found the partition wall and the tile floor and the shelf she had built and the small arrangement of her things on it, the camp kit, the folded blankets, the extra socks, rolled and stacked, and all of it was present in the light, all of it visible and clear and part of the same space. She sat on the edge of the platform and looked at it. It was a room, not a shelter, not a space she was surviving in, not a place she was enduring while she waited for something else to happen. It was a room with a ceiling and walls and a floor and light in it, and all of the things in it were her things, placed where she had put them, arranged according to her own logic, belonging to her in the specific way that the things in a room belong to the person who lives in it. She had been inside this bunker for 17 months, and this was the first night it had felt like that. She spent the rest of the $212 on propane canisters, a waterproof tarp she secured over the mound above the bunker as an additional water barrier before November, and 2 pairs of wool socks from a sporting goods liquidation at $7 each. That was the full $212. Every cent of it accounted for every purchase, deliberate, every item on the list addressed in order of its impact. She went into the second winter different from how she had gone into the first. February 2021 was the coldest month Tacoma had seen in several years. The temperature dropped into the mid-20s on the worst nights, which is not extreme cold by the standards of the interior of the country, but is not common for a coastal city that is moderated by the water, and the cold that came with it had the specific quality of maritime cold, which is a different thing from dry cold. It is heavier. It sits on surfaces and in joints and in the gaps between things. It is the kind of cold that the old hands in the region respect, in a way they do not always respect the dry cold of Montana or the Dakotas, because they know what it does to things that are wet or exposed. Maya was neither wet nor exposed. She ran the heater twice on the coldest night, once at 9 in the evening, before she got into the sleeping bags, and once at 1 in the morning when she woke and the outer bag was no longer quite enough. She cracked the blast door both times 2 inches, watching the indicator light on the heater stay green. She watched the water in the plastic bottle she kept on the shelf. In the morning, there was a thin skin of ice on the inside surface of the bottle, just a film, just the very outer layer of the water nearest the cold air. The bottle was almost entirely liquid. The air in the room was cold enough to do that to water in a plastic bottle left exposed. She was sleeping fine. She would think about that later, about what it meant. Not just that she had survived, but that she had built something that worked well enough that she could sleep through the coldest night of a cold winter and wake up rested. The work she had done on the floor, in the walls, in the ceiling, and the sleeping setup, all of it in sequence. All of it addressing the right problem at the right time. It had amounted to something. It had amounted to a system. And the system worked, and she had built it herself out of things other people had thrown away. And the total cost of everything in it was less than what some people spent on a single dinner. She was not thinking about any of that when she found the note. She was thinking about the ventilation problem. The heater was burning clean, and the low oxygen shutoff was working, and she was cracking the door whenever she ran it. But she had noticed over the past few months a quality in the air of the bunker. On the mornings when she had not cracked the door at all, the previous day, a slight headache, a mild heaviness behind her eyes that was not quite a headache, but was related to one. She knew what this was, or she suspected it: carbon dioxide accumulation in a sealed space occupied by a single breathing human for many hours at a time. Not dangerous at the levels she was experiencing, but a sign that the air exchange in the bunker was not sufficient for extended occupation, and a problem that would get worse in winter when she was keeping the door sealed against the cold for longer periods. She needed a ventilation solution. The bunker's original designers had thought about this. There were two ventilation penetrations in the concrete, one near the top of the curve on the north side and one on the south side near the door. Original equipment from 1962, designed to allow air exchange while maintaining the sealed integrity of the structure against overpressure events. Both penetrations had been capped decades ago with concrete plugs neatly formed, set flush with the wall. She had noticed them in her first survey of the space and filed them away. Now she went back to look at them more carefully. The north penetration was sealed with what appeared to be a concrete patch that was slightly different in color from the surrounding wall, lighter gray, probably poured later to close off the original pipe. The south penetration had a capped pipe end visible at the surface of the concrete, a 2-inch galvanized steel pipe, capped with a threaded plug that had been wrench tightened and then painted over. The pipe could be opened. She bought a pipe wrench from the Goodwill tool section for $3 and spent a Saturday morning working the plug loose, fighting the rust and the painted-over threads until the plug moved and then turned and finally came free in a small shower of rust dust. Behind the plug, the pipe ran back through the concrete at a slight upward angle, and as far as she could tell by shining the flashlight into it, emerged somewhere in the earth above the bunker. Clean air, or as clean as Tacoma air ever was. A passage between the sealed space and the outside world that was 8 feet of concrete and earth away from being open. She found a battery-powered fan at a thrift store, small, the kind used for personal cooling, $3. She modified it with a section of flexible plastic tubing she scrounged from behind the car parts shop, duct taped to the fan housing, and fitted loosely into the mouth of the pipe. When she ran the fan, it pushed air through the pipe, creating a slow, continuous exchange between the interior of the bunker and whatever space the pipe emerged into above. She could not feel the airflow. It was too slow for that. But the headache stopped. She was routing the tubing along the wall and securing it with aluminum tape when she decided to pull the old control panel off the wall. It had been bothering her since she moved in the panel with its rows of switches and dials that had not functioned in decades, occupying a section of wall just to the right of the blast door where she needed clear wall space for her things. She had been working around it for months, and now she had the tools and the motivation, and she pried the panel away from the wall with a flat bar she had found in the lot, working each mounting bolt loose one at a time, the panel swinging outward from the wall as the last bolt came free. Behind the panel, in the space between the panel's mounting frame and the concrete wall, was a folded piece of paper. She almost did not notice it. It was the same color as the concrete dust, and had been there long enough that its edges had softened, and it had taken on the faint gray of everything else in that space. She would have missed it entirely if the panel had not swung outward and knocked it loose, sending it fluttering to the tile floor at her feet. She picked it up. It was folded once. The paper was old, the kind of yellow that takes decades to crease at the fold, dark with age. She unfolded it carefully because it felt like it might tear at the fold line if she rushed it. Inside was a handwritten note written in ballpoint pen. The ink faded to a pale blue gray that was still legible if she angled it toward the lantern light. The handwriting was neat and small, the handwriting of someone who wrote carefully. She read it once, then read it again. It said, "This is the quietest place I've ever been in my life. I come here on Tuesdays. Nobody knows. The clock they installed doesn't work anymore, but I don't need it. I need the quiet." Below that a date, March 14th, 1971. Below the date, a name, R. Calloway. Maintenance. She stood there with the piece of paper in her hands and looked at it for a long time. R. Calloway Maintenance. A man who had serviced this building in 1971, who had come here on Tuesdays with his maintenance schedule and his keys, and who had found in this sealed and silent room the same thing she had found, which was the complete absence of everything the outside world was doing, the specific quality of stillness that a room built to withstand the end of the world has, when nothing is ending, when it is just Tuesday, and the city is going about its business, and inside these concrete walls there is nothing but quiet. A man who had folded a piece of paper and pressed it into the gap behind the control panel and left it there not for anyone to find, just to leave something of himself in the only place he had ever had to himself. Nobody knows. She read those two words 3 times. She folded the paper along its original crease, carefully following the old fold line exactly, and put it in the breast pocket of her jacket, where she kept the things she needed close. She pressed her hand flat against the pocket for a moment and felt the slight thickness of it there. She was not the first person who had found something in this place that the rest of the world did not know about. She was not the first person to need the quiet. She was not the first person for whom nobody knew. She did not find this comforting exactly in the simple way that comfort works. It was more complicated than comfort. It was the strange and unexpected feeling of being part of something that was longer than yourself. A line that stretched back to a Tuesday in 1971, and a man with a maintenance schedule and a need for silence that he could not explain to anyone. A line that would stretch forward too, she supposed, to whoever came next, whoever found their way through the fence gap and through the blast door into the quiet room where R. Calloway had once sat and thought about nothing in particular. She went back to routing the ventilation tubing. She taped the last section flush to the wall and switched on the small fan and listened to it run. The sound it made was low and steady and barely audible, a slight mechanical hum that blended with the general silence of the space rather than breaking it. She thought R. Calloway would have liked the lantern. The summer of 2021 came in warm, and Maya worked more consistently through it. The day labor connection had become something more reliable by then. Not a formal job, but a name on a list that got called before the list was finished, which was a different thing from waiting to see if your name came up. She worked 4 and 5 days most weeks through June and July, and by August, she had more in savings than she had ever had before, enough that the question of what to do next started to feel less hypothetical. It was in August that she came back to the bunker one evening and stopped at the fence line and looked at the lot. There were stakes in the ground along the fence perimeter. Orange stakes, plastic, the kind used to mark survey work, each one with a small orange flag at the top that moved in the evening wind. There were 6 of them that she could see evenly spaced along the north fence line, and 2 more at the corner posts. She stood at the fence and looked at them and did not move for a full minute. She knew what survey stakes meant. She had seen them on other sites through the summer on the blocks between the industrial corridor and the residential neighborhoods that were beginning to attract the attention of developers as the city's western waterfront grew more expensive and less available. Survey stakes meant that someone had engaged a surveyor, which meant someone was interested in the property in a way that involved professionals and paperwork and potentially plans. Survey stakes did not necessarily mean demolition. They meant someone was paying attention. She felt the thing she expected to feel, which was fear. A specific fear, the fear of loss, of having something taken, which was a fear she had some experience with. She stood there and let it happen the way she had stood in the dark with the flooded floor, and let that happen because the feeling was real, and she had learned that pretending feelings were not happening was a way of being surprised by them later in more inconvenient circumstances. Then she went through the fence gap and crossed the lot and unlocked the blast door and went inside. She set the lantern on the shelf. The light went everywhere the way it always did, finding the ceiling and the walls and the floor and making the room present. She sat on the edge of the platform. She thought about what she knew. She knew someone was surveying the lot. She did not know who. She did not know whether they intended to buy the lot or simply assess it. She did not know what came after assessment. She did not know the timeline or the intent or the outcome. She knew none of these things, and she had no way of finding them out quickly, and she had no power to influence whatever process was underway. What she had power over was the interior of the bunker. This was the thing that clarified when she sat with the fear long enough for the fear to settle. She could not control what was happening outside the blast door. She could not control the survey stakes or the people who placed them or whatever decision was being made by whatever entity had decided to look at this corner lot between a shuttered building and a car parts business. She had no leverage out there and no information and no power. But inside this door, everything that had been done by her. The tile floor with its grout lines and its ceramic pieces salvaged from a dumpster. The foam board walls that held the still air against the cold. The partition wall with its straightened nails and its pallet board lumber. The sleeping platform. The ventilation pipe with its small fan. The lantern throwing its warm light across the arch of the ceiling. All of it was the product of her time and her attention and her willingness to solve one problem and then the next problem and then the next one after that. None of it could be taken from her the way the bunker itself could be taken. What she had learned in building it was hers in a way that could not be surveyed or staked or appraised. She got up and went to the back room, the partition section, and looked at what needed to be done. She had been putting off reinforcing the upper section of the partition wall where one of the uprights had developed a slight lean. She had been meaning to add a diagonal brace. She had the materials. She had the nails. She started working. She worked until the lantern battery started to dim, and then she worked by flashlight for another hour until the partition was solid and the diagonal brace was set and the lean was corrected, the framing square against the ceiling gap in the floor. She did not hurry. She did not do the work any differently than she would have done it without the survey stakes outside. She did the work as well as she knew how to do it. She could not control what happened outside. She could control what happened inside. She set the flashlight on the shelf and sat on the platform and looked at the room in the dimming lantern light, all of it, the ceiling and the walls and the tile floor and the partition and the ventilation tube and the sleeping bags and the shelf with the camp kit and the extra socks rolled in pairs and the tin can full of straightened nails and the camp pot and the small stack of paperback books she had accumulated from the free library boxes on Commerce Street. She looked at all of it. Then she changed the lantern battery and the light came back full and warm and even spreading out across the curve of the ceiling the way it always did. She made herself dinner on the camp stove, rice from the pantry, and a can of beans heated in the camp pot, eaten from the pot with a spoon. She ate all of it, every bite. Then she nested herself into the sleeping bags and lay back and looked at the ceiling and listened to the small fan running and the absolute silence of the rest of the world beyond the concrete and the earth above her. She was going to stay, not because she was stubborn, not because she was not afraid of the survey stakes or of what they might mean. She was afraid of what they might mean. She stayed because staying was a choice and leaving was a choice. And she had looked at both of them clearly, and the choice that made sense was to keep building, to keep making the thing better with the time she had, however much time that turned out to be. She had started in this place as someone who reacted, someone who moved when moved against, who survived the cold by responding to it, who fixed the problems as they arrived. The stakes outside were doing something to that. They were pulling her forward past the reactive posture into something else, something that required her to act in the direction she wanted to go, rather than simply away from what she did not want. She could not stop a developer, but she could keep laying tile. She could keep straightening nails. She could keep doing the work that made the space more what she needed it to be. And she could do it more deliberately now, more intentionally, because she understood that every hour she spent inside those walls was an hour she was building something that was hers, regardless of what happened to the structure that contained it. Outside, the orange flags moved in the wind off the port. Inside, the lantern burned steady, and even the light going everywhere, filling the vault of the ceiling, making the room real. The survey stakes stayed through the fall of 2021, And into the winter, and then into the spring of 2022, the orange flags fading in the rain and sun, the plastic shafts tilting slightly as the ground softened and shifted through the wet months. Nobody came to pull them. Nobody came to do anything further with them. They stood in their evenly spaced line along the north fence and moved in the wind and meant nothing that Maya could determine, because the action they had seemed to promise whatever the survey had been the beginning of had not materialized into anything she could see or feel or respond to. She stopped looking at them sometime around February of 2022, not because she had stopped caring whether the lot would be developed, but because caring about a thing you cannot influence while simultaneously neglecting the things you can influence is a form of waste she could not afford. She had learned this in the first winter. She had learned it in the dark with the flooded floor and the camp pot in her hand, and she had learned it again with the ventilation pipe and the partition wall and the diagonal brace she had set while the orange flags moved outside. You worked on what was inside your reach. You put that work down when it was done, and then you looked for the next thing that was inside your reach. Everything outside that circle you watched, you noted, you filed, and you did not spend yourself on it. What was inside her reach in the spring and summer of 2022 was the job. The day-labor connection had shifted by then into something more consistent. A woman named Denise, who ran the scheduling at a commercial cleaning company, had taken note of Maya the previous fall, after Maya had spent 8 hours alone in a building that was being turned over between tenants, cleaning it more thoroughly and in better sequence than the three-person crew that had done the previous building, because she had observed the three-person crew's process and identified where they were losing time, and she had simply not lost that time. Denise had asked her at the end of the day if she wanted regular hours. Maya had said yes. She worked 4 days a week through the spring, 5 days through the summer. The work was physical and unglamorous, and she was good at it. Good in the way that she was good at most physical tasks that required attention and patience and a clear understanding of the order in which things needed to happen. She cleaned commercial kitchens and office floors and the lobbies of buildings being prepared for new tenants, and she did it well, and she showed up when she was supposed to, and she did not make problems for anyone. By the summer of 2022, she had more money saved than at any point since she had arrived in Tacoma 3 years before. She was 23 years old. She had been living in the bunker for 3 years and 4 months. The third winter was better than the second, which had been better than the first, which was how it was supposed to work, which was how anything worked when you kept solving the problems in order and did not skip steps. She had a second heater by then, a buddy unit she had bought from a man at the day labor pickup who was clearing out a storage space, $30 the same model as her first one. She put the first heater in the main room and the second in the back section of the partition and ran them on a rotation. She did not need both rooms heated simultaneously. She was in the main room at night and in the back room during the day when she was reading or mending or writing in the journal. She had started in the fall of 2021 a composition notebook from the dollar store on Pacific Avenue, the first journal she had ever kept. She wrote in it the way she did most things, without performance, without an audience in mind. Just the facts of what she had done and what she had observed, and occasionally what she was thinking in plain declarative sentences that said what they meant and nothing more. She wrote about the survey stakes. She wrote about R. Calloway and the piece of paper she kept in her breast pocket. She wrote about Vera, who she still saw at the food pantry occasionally. Vera, who had given her 3 rules in a warming shelter and saved her life with them, without either of them using that language. She wrote about the lower level, the flooded room below the stairs, which she had not yet solved, and which remained a presence in the back of her, thinking a problem she had filed without resolving a room she had not yet been inside. She was writing in the journal on a Tuesday evening in late August 2022 when she heard something at the fence. She heard it the way she heard most things inside the bunker, faintly, the earth and concrete absorbing most of the outside world sounds before they reached her. A metallic sound, the sound of chain link moving in a specific way that was different from the way it moved in the wind, the way it moved when something with weight pushed against it or gripped it. She had heard this sound before twice in the 3 years she had been in the bunker, both times teenagers cutting through the lot to get from the street to the rail yard. And both times they had moved through quickly without looking at the mound or the blast door, without appearing to register that anything unusual was present in the back corner of the lot. She switched off the lantern. She sat still. She heard footsteps on the lot, not running, walking carefully the way someone walked in an unfamiliar space where they were not sure of the footing. She heard them come to a stop somewhere near the center of the lot, and then she heard nothing for a while, which meant the person was standing still. Then a voice, not loud, not calling out, almost conversational, directed toward the mound. "I can see your light from the fence." She said nothing. "The propane smell too," the voice said, "when the wind comes from this direction." A pause. She heard him shift his weight. His footsteps moved a few steps to one side and then stopped again. "I'm not going to do anything," he said. "I'm just letting you know I know." She sat in the dark for a moment longer. Then she switched the lantern back on, which would be visible as a thin line of light at the base of the blast door. She heard him settle the sound of someone lowering themselves to sit on the ground leaning against something. He was going to wait. She opened the blast door. He was sitting on the concrete rim of the mound, about 8 feet from the door, his back to her, looking toward the far end of the lot. He was younger than his voice had suggested, or at least younger than the voice of someone who had known enough to look for the light and smell the propane. 27 or 28, she estimated. Dark jacket, work boots, a duffel bag at his feet that had the practiced compression of someone who carried everything they owned in it. His posture was neither threatening nor anxious. He was simply waiting with the patience of someone who was good at waiting. He turned his head when he heard the door but did not stand up. "Joel," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Maya." He nodded once. He looked at the blast door, at the civil defense plate beside it, at the curve of the mound above. He had the look of someone seeing something they had been thinking about for a while. "How long have you been in there?" he said. 3 years. He took that in without expression. "Is it dry?" "Mostly," she said. "There's a lower level that floods. The upper level stays dry." He nodded again, slower this time. He was looking at the civil defense plate again, reading the text she had read 100 times by now. She watched him read it. "Do you know what this is?" he said. "Civil Defense Shelter," she said. 1962. "More than that," he said. He looked at her. "Do you know who owns it?" She did not answer immediately. She had thought about ownership in the first weeks and then filed it in the category of things she could not determine. Without resources, she did not have an attorney or a title search or some other instrument of the formal world that was not available to her. She had proceeded on the basis that the lot was effectively abandoned, which it was in every practical sense. She had not resolved the question of who owned it in any legal sense because resolving it would have required her to announce herself to someone, and announcing herself to someone was a thing she had not been prepared to do. "No," she said. Joel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. He held it out toward her without standing. She crossed the space between them and took it. It was a photocopy of a document, official-looking text in small print, a city of Tacoma seal at the top. She angled it toward the light coming from the open blast door. It was a property record. She scanned the text until she found the section she was looking for. The lot and the structure on it were listed as decommissioned city property, transferred from Federal Civil Defense Administration to the city of Tacoma in 1979, when the Federal Civil Defense Program was reorganized. The transfer document included a preservation stipulation, standard language from the era designating the structure as a civic heritage asset of the second category, which meant it could not be sold, demolished, or substantially altered without a formal review by the city's Historical Preservation Committee, a process that required public notice and a minimum 60-day comment period. She read that section twice. Then she looked at the survey stakes along the north fence. "The survey," she said. "Private assessment company," Joel said. "They don't have authority to do anything with the property. They can assess it, but they can't act on it without going through the Preservation Committee, and the Preservation Committee hasn't had a petition filed for this property in at least 10 years. He paused. "I checked." She looked at him. "Why did you check?" He looked at the blast door. He looked at the civil defense plate. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone deciding how much to say. "I've been looking for this structure for 2 years," he said. "I found a reference to it in a city archive while I was looking for something else. A 1962 Civil Defense Survey document with a site map. I've been trying to find the physical location. He looked around the lot. I wasn't expecting someone to already be in it. She folded the photocopy carefully and held it out to him. He shook his head. Keep it, he said. I made it for you. She stood in the doorway of the blast door with the photocopy in her hand and looked at this man sitting on the concrete rim of the mound in the last light of a Tuesday evening in August. And she thought about what it meant that he had gone to the archive and found the document and made a copy and brought it here to someone he had never met. She thought about R. Calloway and his Tuesday visits and the note behind the control panel. She thought about Tuesday, specifically this particular day of the week, and its relationship to this particular place. And the thought was not logical, but it felt true in the way some things feel true before you can explain them. She said, "There's a back room." He looked at her. "In the partition section," she said. "It's smaller, about 40 square feet. You'd need your own sleeping situation." He looked at his duffel bag. He looked at the blast door. 40 square feet is a lot, he said. Joel moved in on a Saturday. He had a sleeping bag, a foam pad, and the duffel. He was, as she had noted from the first evening, very quiet. He had a quality of presence that did not intrude, that occupied exactly the space it needed and no more. He made no changes to the partition room without asking first. He kept his things compressed and organized against his section of the wall. He was up before her in the mornings and came back in the evenings, and in the hours they were both in the bunker. They were mostly in their own rooms doing their own things, and the sounds they made were small and domestic and unremarkable. The sounds of two people living with the particular courtesy of people who understand what shared space costs. They split the propane that winter, $20 each per month, $4 propane canisters bought in packs when they were on sale. It was enough. The winter of 2022 into 2023 was not the coldest winter she had spent in the bunker, but it was the first winter she had not spent alone in it, and the difference was not what she had expected. She had expected it to be more difficult, more complicated, the management of another person's presence in a space she had organized entirely around her own needs. It was not more difficult. It was different in a way she had not anticipated and could not have described in advance. Two bodies in a sealed, insulated space produce heat. This is simple physics. The air temperature in the bunker on the coldest nights ran several degrees warmer than it had the previous two winters, not because of the heaters, which were the same, but because of the additional metabolic heat of a second human being breathing and moving and existing in the space. She noticed it in the first week and mentioned it to Joel, and he said that made sense, and they talked for a while about thermal mass and insulation values and the R value of the foam board on the walls. A technical conversation that was also, she understood, the beginning of a friendship, two people finding the ground they could meet on. But the other thing, the thing she had not expected and could not have planned for, was the sound. She had been alone in the bunker for 3 years and 4 months before Joel moved in. 3 years and 4 months of knowing every sound the structure made, which was not many sounds because it was a very quiet place, but which were all hers, all cataloged and understood and accounted for. The low drum of heavy rain on the earth above the vault, the faint mechanical hum of the small fan in the ventilation pipe, the occasional creak of the partition wall when the temperature differential between the two rooms changed, the sound of her own breathing in the dark, which she had become so accustomed to that she no longer heard it consciously, only noticed its absence when she held her breath. Now there were 2 sets of breathing, 2 sets of footsteps on the tile, 2 sets of small domestic sounds, the camp stove, the rustle of a sleeping bag, the particular sound of someone turning pages in the dark with a flashlight. The bunker was not louder exactly. It had the same quality of deep silence that it had always had, the concrete and the earth absorbing the outside world completely. But inside that silence there was now more information, more texture, more evidence of human presence than the bunker had held before. She noticed it most on the nights when the rain came heavy and the drum above them deepened, and she lay in the sleeping bags in the dark and listened to it. And on the other side of the partition wall, she could hear Joel's breathing slow and even, and she thought someone else hears this too. Not just the rain, the specific quality of rain on earth over a concrete vault, that low resonant drum that you felt in the center of your chest, as much as you heard it with your ears. Someone else was hearing it and feeling it, and lying in the dark with it. And the fact of that shared experience, wordless and invisible and private, was different from any shared experience she had had before. She would try to explain this later and find that she could not quite. The closest she could get was this: she had spent 3 years in a space knowing every sound it made and knowing that she was the only one who knew. Having someone else there meant that the sounds of the place were no longer only hers. They belonged to two people. And things that belong to two people are different from things that belong to one, not better necessarily, just different in a way that changes the weight of them. Joel knew things. This became clear over the winter in small increments, not through conversation exactly, but through the evidence of how he moved through the space and what he noticed. He had some background in construction, she gathered, or in trades adjacent to construction, because he looked at the partition wall and the foam board installation and the tile floor with the eye of someone who understood what had been done and who could see the decisions behind the work. He did not comment on these things as compliments, which she would have found hollow. He commented on them as information, noting one evening that the foam board seams could be better air sealed with a second layer of tape along the vertical joints, which was true and which she had known and simply not gotten around to. He came back the next day with a roll of aluminum tape from the hardware store on South Tacoma Way, and they did the joints together one evening while the heater ran and the lantern threw its light across the ceiling. He helped her with the ventilation pipe in January, adding a second penetration on the opposite side of the room, using a hammer drill he borrowed from a job site, drilling through 4 inches of concrete at an upward angle and threading another length of flexible tubing through to serve as a passive intake, while the fan-assisted pipe became the exhaust. The air exchange improved immediately. The slight morning heaviness she had been managing for years, the low-grade CO2 accumulation that never quite went away, cleared within a week. He was useful in the way of someone who understood problems and worked on them without needing to be asked who saw what needed to be done, and did it without converting the doing into a claim on anyone's gratitude. She appreciated this in the specific way of someone who had been managing everything alone for a long time and who did not need a partner but recognized unexpectedly what it felt like when one appeared. They talked in the evening sometimes, not about their histories, not in the detailed way of people who have decided to know each other, in the way of people who are sharing a space and have found that they think about some of the same things. They talked about the structure, about the engineering of it, about what it meant that someone in 1962 had sat down and decided that a city of this size needed a certain number of structures capable of protecting a certain number of people for a certain number of days against certain categories of catastrophe. They talked about the math of it. They talked about the materials, the aggregate mix in the concrete walls, which Joel said was unusually high quality for the era, which suggested someone had specified it carefully rather than using the minimum standard. They were serious about it, he said one evening in the way of someone who had been thinking about this for a while. About the shelter, Maya said. About the people who were going to be in it, he said. People they didn't know. People who would show up here in an emergency and need the building to work. He paused. They built it like it mattered is what I mean. Like the strangers they were building it for mattered. She looked at the wall, the foam board, the tape joints, the tile floor. She thought about that for a long time after he went to sleep. The lower level had been present in her thinking for 3.5 years. She had looked at it through the flashlight beam every few months, noting the water level which fluctuated with the season, lower in summer, when the water table dropped, and higher in late fall and winter, when the rain drove the groundwater up through the soil. She had never been down there. She had never had the means to go down there, because going down there meant getting the water out, and getting the water out was a problem she had filed as beyond her resources, which it had been for most of the time she had been in the bunker. You needed a pump or a very long time or both. In February 2023, Joel came back from a job site with a hand pump in a canvas bag, the kind used for transferring fluids, a piston pump with a 6-foot section of hose on each end. He set it on the shelf and said nothing for a moment. The lower level, Maya said. If you want, he said. She looked at the pump. She looked at the staircase opening in the far corner of the room. The darkness below it, the water she could see shining faintly when the lantern light fell at the right angle down the stairs. Yes, she said. They started on a Saturday morning in late February. The method was simple and extremely slow. They lowered one end of the hose into the water below and ran the other end out through the blast door and across the lot to the lowest point of the fence line, where there was a drainage channel cut into the concrete curb of the street. Joel worked the pump handle, which required sustained effort, and produced a thin stream of water from the output hose, and Maya managed the input hose below, keeping it submerged as the water level dropped, moving it to follow the surface. They worked in shifts, switching at the pump handle every 20 minutes because the work was muscular and continuous and numbing after a while. The first day they dropped the water level by about 8 inches. They worked at it every Saturday and some evenings during the week when they were both home early enough. 3 weeks of it, 12 or 13 sessions, the water level dropping steadily in uneven increments, faster when the weather was dry, and the water table was lower, slower after a heavy rain event when the groundwater pushed back. They could see more of the lower level with each session. The tops of the metal shelving units had been visible from the beginning. Then the upper shelves appeared, then the middle shelves, then the lower shelves, and they could see that the shelves were not empty, that there were things on them, boxes and packages, and equipment wrapped in what appeared to be heavy plastic sheeting, the kind used for moisture protection in long-term storage. The floor of the lower level appeared on a Saturday morning in mid-March. The pump sucked air, and Maya called up to Joel to stop, and she walked to the top of the staircase and looked down, and the floor was there. Concrete damp with residual moisture, but clear, the last puddles resting in the low spots, thin and still. The smell was different from the smell of the upper level wetter, more mineral, the smell of a space that had been closed and damp for decades. But the structure was intact. The walls were solid. The shelving units, though red with surface rust on their steel frames, were standing. The things on them were wrapped and sealed. She went down the stairs. The staircase was solid, the bolts holding the steel treads gritty with mineral deposit from the standing water, but not corroded through. She stepped off the bottom stair onto the floor of the lower level and stood still for a moment, adjusting to the space. Joel came down behind her. They both had flashlights, and they swept the beams around the room together. It was larger than she had estimated from above, substantially larger. She walked the diameter and counted it out at close to 25 feet, which made the lower level the bigger of the two rooms, roughly 500 square feet of clear floor space, with the ceiling following the same vault as the upper level, lower here, by design perhaps 10 feet at the peak. The walls were the same poured concrete. There was another ventilation penetration on the south wall. The concrete was stained with waterline marks at various heights, recording the history of every flooding event. The room had seen a series of horizontal bands rising from the floor to the highest point, which was about 4 feet up the wall. She walked to the shelving units. The wrapping on the contents was thick plastic sheeting, the industrial kind, and it had been sealed with wide tape that had dried and lost most of its adhesion over the decades, but had still kept the plastic mostly closed. The wrapped bundles, swollen slightly with the moisture that had worked its way in, but intact enough that the contents were protected from direct contact with the water. She pulled the plastic back from the nearest bundle on the middle shelf. Inside was a stack of folded wool blankets, gray, heavy, dry. She lifted one. It was dense and tightly woven, and it smelled of old wool and something faintly chemical that might have been a preservative treatment. She shook it out, and it fell open full-size, the wool, heavy and even, and with all of its loft still present, not degraded, not rotted. 60 years of sealed storage in a flooded room, and the wool was dry. She laid it over the shelf and opened the next bundle. Tin cans. Dozens of them labeled in the stenciled print of a government procurement era long past. Beans, corn, tomatoes, fruit cocktail. The labels were legible. The cans were not bloated. The seams were intact. She picked one up, and it was heavy and solid, and the lid was perfectly formed. She moved along the shelves. A box of bandages sealed in waxed cardboard bone, dry inside. A hand-crank radio, olive drab military specification with a canvas carry case that had stiffened but not cracked. A folded canvas tarp, heavy-duty dry. 3 one-gallon water containers, empty, the plastic clouded with age but uncracked. More blankets. More cans. A box of wooden matches in a waterproof container. A first aid manual dated 1961 in a plasticized cover. A small toolkit, wrenches and pliers, and a hand drill, each tool oiled and wrapped in oilcloth. She went through every shelf in the lower level, methodically starting at the left and working to the right, unwrapping and opening and examining the contents of each bundle and package. It took nearly 2 hours. Joel moved with her but did not speak, which was the right thing not to do. At the end of the last shelf, she stopped. She stood in the lower level of the bunker in a room she had not been inside for the 3.5 years she had been living above it, and she looked at what surrounded her. Blankets enough for 12 or 15 people, food enough to feed them for weeks, medical supplies, communication equipment, tools, everything that a specific number of people would need to survive a specific category of catastrophe, selected and purchased and wrapped and sealed and placed here by people who had thought carefully about what those needs would be. Joel was standing at the other end of the room. He said quietly, "They stocked it." She said nothing. "They built it and they stocked it," he said, "for people they were never going to meet." She was looking at the blankets. The wool blankets dry after 60 years in a flooded room, still holding their weight, and their loft still capable of warming the body of a stranger who needed them. She was thinking about the engineer who had specified the unusually high-quality concrete aggregate. She was thinking about the procurement officer who had ordered the blankets and the waxed cardboard and the waterproof storage containers. She was thinking about whoever it was who had come down here in 1962 or 1963 or sometime in the early years of the structure's life and placed each item on its shelf in the right position with the wrapping sealed against the moisture they knew would eventually come, because they understood that concrete vaults in the water table eventually flood, and they had planned for that too. She was thinking about R. Calloway, who had found the quiet of the upper room on Tuesdays and had left a note behind the control panel for no one, who had not known about the lower level perhaps, or had known and not written about it, but who had found something in the structure that he needed and had taken it without taking it, had rested in it, and then locked the door behind him, the way she had locked the door behind her on her way out every day for 3.5 years. She was thinking about Vera, about 3 rules given by a woman in a warming shelter to a 20-year-old, with $34 rules given with no expectation of return, given because they were true and because the person standing in front of her needed them. She was thinking about the orange survey stakes, the people who placed them, whoever they were, who had looked at this corner of a vacant lot and thought about what they could build on it, who had not known and perhaps could not have imagined what was already here, what had been here since 1962, what had been waiting here for 60 years for someone to need it. She sat down on the floor. The concrete was cold and still damp in places. She sat on it anyway, cross-legged on the floor of the lower level of the civil defense bunker on the vacant lot in the industrial corridor of Tacoma, Washington. And she sat there without moving for a long time. Joel sat down too near the stairs, his back against the wall, giving her the space of the room. She could not have said precisely what she felt in that moment. It was not grief, though there was something in it that resembled grief, in the way that certain intense experiences resemble their neighbors without being them. It was not gratitude, though, that was present too. It was something older and simpler and harder to name. It was the feeling of being inside something that was larger than yourself in every dimension, larger in time, larger in intention, larger in the scope of its care. She was 23 years old, and she had been solving problems alone in this structure for 3.5 years, and she had thought of the solving as something she was doing as the product of her own particular attention and patience and refusal to stop. She was not wrong about that. The solving was hers. But she was sitting now in a room where someone else had solved problems for her before she existed, where people she would never know had asked a question, which was, what will a stranger need and how do we make sure it's here when they arrive? And then they had answered it, with wool blankets and tin cans and waterproof containers and high-quality concrete and a ventilation system and a blast door that still moved when you applied steady pressure to it 60 years after they had installed it. They had built the answer and walked away, and she had walked into it. She sat on the floor of the lower level for a long time. The preparations for leaving began in March, not because anything had forced it, not because the survey stakes had become anything more than survey stakes, or because someone had filed a petition with the Preservation Committee, or because any external pressure had changed the situation on the ground in any way she could measure. The preparations began because something inside her had shifted the way things shift, when a decision that has been forming for a long time finally becomes a decision when the balance tips. Not because something new has been added on either side, but because it has simply reached the tipping point. She had enough money. That was the factual part of it. She had been working steadily for Denise's company, and she had been spending almost nothing because she had no rent and no utility bills, and her food costs were low, and propane costs were split with Joel. She had enough for first and last month's rent on a room in a shared house, which was the specific unit of housing she had been researching on the library computer since the fall. She had found the shared house on Hilltop, 3 rooms, 2 other tenants, a lease that required first and last, and a background check, and a copy of her pay stubs, all of which she now had. She also had enough in a different sense that was harder to quantify. She had arrived in the bunker at 20 years old, not knowing how to do most of what she had spent the next 3.5 years doing. She had not known how to insulate a concrete wall, or lay tile on a cold slab, or pull and straighten nails from reclaimed lumber, or calibrate the balance between ventilation and heat retention in a sealed space. She had not known any of that. She had learned it here piece by piece, problem by problem, winter by winter. She had learned it the only way any of it can be learned, which is by doing it in real conditions, for real stakes, making the mistakes, and correcting them and moving to the next problem. She was not the same person who had stood in the center of the upper level in the summer of 2019 with a flashlight and said to no one that this was more than she needed. She was not smarter or more capable in any abstract sense. She was more specific. She understood more specific things about more specific problems, and she knew how to break new problems down into the sequence of steps that made them solvable. And she knew that this process of breaking down and solving was not something that happened to you, but something you did, that it required the same kind of attention every time, the same patience, the same willingness to stay with the problem past the point where you wanted to leave. She told Joel in early April. She told him clearly and directly, which was the only way she knew how to say things that mattered. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the floor for a moment, and then at the wall, and then at her. "The back room," he said. "Yes," she said, "if you want it." He nodded slowly. He did not say thank you, which was correct. You do not say thank you for a room in a bunker on a vacant lot. You say yes or you say no, and you understand what is being offered and you treat it accordingly. She spent the last 2 weeks in the bunker going through her things and deciding what to keep and what to leave and what to give. She had accumulated very little, which was a deliberate condition she had maintained throughout, because space was finite and the things you owned were the things you were responsible for carrying. But some of it had accumulated anyway, the slow accumulation of 3.5 years of small acquisitions, and found objects and things that had served purposes and outlasted those purposes and found their way onto shelves. The sleeping bags she would have left, except that it was cold enough in April that she still needed them, and she folded them and put them in a bag she had found in the backroom storage. The yoga mat she left for Joel. The extra wool blankets, 2 of them, she left for Joel. The propane heater in the main room she had already told Joel he could keep. The spare canisters of propane 4 stacked neatly in the storage room she left. She went through the partition wall into the back room and looked at the storage. The reserve tile pieces stacked against the wall she left. The tools, the box cutter and the pipe wrench and the pry bar she left. The tin can of straightened nails she had spent hours bending over the rebar she left on the shelf. The paperback books, 12 of them acquired from the free library boxes on Commerce Street over 3 years, she stacked neatly on the shelf in the main room for Joel. The journal she kept. It was full now, every page, and she had bought a second composition notebook in the fall and filled half of that one too. She put both of them in her bag, the lantern she kept, the batteries she left. And in the breast pocket of her jacket, where it had been for the better part of 2 years, she had the piece of paper. The folded piece of paper with R. Calloway's handwriting on it, the ink faded to pale blue-gray, the crease darkened with age along the original fold line. She had not thought about whether to keep it. It had never been a question. She kept it. On the morning of April 14th, 2023, she packed the last of her things into the gym bag, that she had arrived in Tacoma with in May 2019. The same bag, though the bag itself had been repaired twice, once at the bottom seam with a needle and thread from the Goodwill, and once at the zipper pull with a bent piece of wire. She set the bag by the blast door. She stood in the center of the upper level and looked at the room. The tile floor, its mismatched ceramic pieces fitted together in the uneven puzzle pattern she had assembled piece by piece over 3 weeks in the summer of 2019. The grout lines irregular and imperfect and completely hers. The foam board walls, their pink industrial face patched and taped along every joint. The dead air they held against the cold, doing the same silent work it had been doing since she pressed them into place. The partition wall with its pallet board lumber and its straightened nails, and the small imperfection in the upper right corner where one nail had gone in at a slight angle and the board had followed it. The sleeping platform extended and reinforced over 3 winters, the rebar straightening marks still visible on the floor near the base where she had worked each nail before driving it. The ventilation pipes, both of them, the fan-assisted exhaust, and Joel's passive intake, the small fan barely audible in its housing. The lantern shelf. The hook on the partition wall where wet things had gone every day for 3.5 years. She looked at all of it for a long time. Then she picked up her bag and stepped through the blast door. Joel was in the back room. She could hear him, the particular sound of him moving in the space, which she knew by now the way you know the sounds of anyone who has shared close quarters with you long enough. She said through the partition wall that she was going. He came to the doorway of the back room. He looked at her. He looked at the bag. The stakes are still there, he said. He did not mean the survey stakes. He meant something else. Something about the work and what it had produced, the thing she was taking with her that could not be put in a bag. He did not have a better word for it, and neither did she, and neither of them tried. Yeah, she said. She crossed the tile floor and stepped through the blast door for the last time. She walked across the lot to the fence gap and stopped and looked back. The mound was the same as it had always been, the blackberry canes and sword fern and laurel covering its curve. The face of the blast door set back into the slope, the civil defense plate beside it with its 1962 date that she could no longer read from this distance, but did not need to read because she had read it many times, and it had long since become part of the fixed furniture of her mind. She looked at it for a moment, just one moment. Then she stepped through the fence gap and out onto the sidewalk. She walked. The room in the shared house on Hilltop was small, smaller than the main room of the bunker by a significant margin. And when she first walked into it with her bag, she stood in the center of it and had a strange, brief vertigo, the feeling of a space being both familiar and wrong, the proportions close but not identical, the ceiling lower, the walls at different angles. She had not spent the night in a room with plaster walls and a painted ceiling in 4 years, and the room's particular silence was different from the bunker's silence. Thinner, the sounds of the other tenants and the street traffic and the birds in the furnace cycling on and off, all present through the walls in a way that was normal and had once been unremarkable and now seemed strange. She set her bag down. She put the lantern on the windowsill. She unfolded R. Calloway's note and smoothed it flat on the surface of the small dresser. She stood in her room and listened to the house for a while. There was a woman named Terry in the room next to hers, early 60s, who worked at a hospital laundry. There was a man named Darnell in the room across the hall, 40s, who worked nights at a shipping terminal. She had met them briefly when the landlord showed her the room. They seemed in the way of people who have arranged their lives inside the practical constraints of what is available, rather than what is preferred, settled, adapted, competent in the specific way of people who have managed difficult circumstances without being undone by them. She recognized them. Not their specifics, their orientation, the way they moved through the house with a knowledge of its particular quirks, where the hot water came slowly and where the window stuck and which floorboard in the hallway creaked underfoot. They had learned those things because they had needed to, because learning the specific qualities of the place you inhabit is how you inhabit it. And they had done it with the same quiet thoroughness that she had done everything in the bunker. She found the cafe on 6th Avenue through a contact she had made at the food pantry, a woman who had spent years connecting people in the network around her to opportunities in the broader city, who kept track of who needed what And who had it in the quiet way of people who understand that the formal structures of employment and assistance are never quite sufficient, and that the gaps between them are where most of the real connecting happens. The cafe needed someone for morning prep 5 in the morning to 1 in the afternoon, 5 days a week. They needed someone reliable. Maya was reliably reliable. She started on a Monday. She learned the kitchen the way she had learned the bunker, methodically and without hurry, understanding the order of operations. Before she tried to optimize any part of it, watching how the sequences worked before she proposed any changes. The head cook, a man named Gerald, who had been making the same things in the same kitchen for 11 years, noticed in the second week that she was anticipating, rather than responding, that she had mapped the rhythm of the prep work well enough to have the next thing ready before he asked for it. He did not comment on this directly. He simply started leaving her to handle more sections of the prep without checking in, which was she understood the way that trust worked in a professional kitchen, incrementally through the evidence of work done correctly. She paid her rent on the first of every month. She had a checking account which she had opened at a credit union that did not require a minimum balance, and her pay was deposited into it directly. And on the first of each month, she transferred the rent amount into the account from which the automatic payment to the landlord would come. She did this the same way she had done everything in the bunker, in the right order, without skipping steps. She saved, not frantically, not with the urgency of someone making up for lost time, but steadily, the way water accumulates in a low spot, the way everything accumulates when you pay attention to where it goes. She did not have many expenses because she had spent 4 years not having many expenses, and the habits of that period were still mostly in place, the awareness of what things actually cost and what difference each cost made to the overall picture. She ate well and she slept enough, and she did her job, and she paid what she owed, and she saved what remained. She thought about the bunker some mornings when the rain came in from the sound, the sideways rain that her body still registered as a call to inventory, an unconscious check of the roof and the walls and the sleeping platform. She would catch herself doing it in the kitchen at the cafe during the long, focused hours of morning prep, her attention on the work in front of her, and some part of her mind running through the list of things that needed to be maintained and monitored before she remembered that the list was not hers anymore, that someone else had it now, that the tile floor and the foam walls and the partition and the ventilation pipes and the tin can of straightened nails were Joel's to tend. She wondered about the lower level sometimes, about the blankets they had unrolled and examined and refolded and put back on the shelves, the tin cans and the canvas tarp and the hand crank radio. Whether Joel had started using any of it, whether he had laid one of those wool blankets over his sleeping bag on the coldest nights. Whether he had thought, as she had thought, about the people who had wrapped those blankets and sealed those containers and stocked those shelves, about the particular quality of care that went into preparing for the needs of people you would never meet, about what it meant to do that, to make that expenditure of time and resource and thought for strangers who might never come, who might never need what you had prepared, but who would have it if they did. She thought about Joel getting connected to transitional housing in May, which was what happened, the details reaching her through the same informal network through which most things reached her. He had stayed in the bunker through April and into May, and then a spot had opened in a transitional housing program connected to one of the service organizations on MLK Way, and he had taken it, leaving the bunker the same way she had left it, locked the combination set, the civil defense plate still readable beside the blast door. She wondered who would find it next. Not with anxiety, more like the way you wonder about a place you've left, the way the imagination follows paths you no longer walk, filling in the spaces you no longer fill. She imagined someone coming through the fence gap on a morning like the morning she had come through it, stopping in the lot and looking at the mound and the curve of vegetation and the blast door set into the slope. She imagined them reading the civil defense plate. She imagined them standing in front of it for a while before they walked away. She hoped they came back. On a Tuesday evening in late May 2023, Maya Reeves sat on the edge of her bed in her room in the shared house on Hilltop and looked at R. Calloway's note on the dresser. The window was open 3 inches. Outside the Tacoma, rain had arrived in its serious form, the sideways form, driving off the sound and hitting the window glass at an angle, the sound of it filling the room with a familiar low percussion that she felt in her chest before she heard it. She had been in the room for 6 weeks. She had learned where the hot water came slowly and where the window stuck. She knew which floorboard in the hallway creaked, and she had learned to step over it, not because it bothered her, but because it bothered Terry, who worked long shifts and slept lightly. These were the things you learned when you paid attention to a place, when you took it seriously as a place, rather than a temporary condition, when you committed to understanding its specific qualities, rather than waiting to be somewhere else. She picked up R. Calloway's note. She unfolded it along its original crease, the paper soft now, with years of handling the fold line dark and supple. She read the words she already knew. This is the quietest place I have ever been in my life. I come here on Tuesdays. Nobody knows. She thought about R. Calloway on his Tuesdays. She thought about the engineers and procurement officers who had specified high-quality concrete and waterproof wrapping for wool blankets that 60 years later were still dry. She thought about Vera, who had given 3 rules to a 20-year-old stranger in a warming shelter with no expectation of return. She thought about Joel, who had made a photocopy of a city property record and brought it across a vacant lot for someone he had never met. She thought about Gerald, the head cook, who had started leaving her to manage sections of the prep without checking in, which was trust expressed through action, the only kind of trust that mattered. She sat with all of it for a while. Here is what she understood, sitting on the edge of her bed with R. Calloway's note in her hands, and the Tacoma rain hitting the window at an angle she had spent 4 years thinking of the bunker as something she had found, something she had made work through her own patience and attention and refusal to stop. Both of those things were true. She had found it. She had made it work. Every tile piece, every straightened nail, every run of aluminum tape along a foam board seam was the product of her own hands and her own time and her own sustained patient problem solving. No one had given her any of that. She had built it herself. But she had also been held by things she had not built. By Vera's 3 rules given freely in a shelter. By R. Calloway's quiet presence across the decades, the evidence of another person who had needed the same silence and found it in the same place. By the engineers and bureaucrats of 1962 who had specified the right concrete and stocked the lower level with wool blankets for strangers. By Joel and his photocopy and his 2 months of shared propane costs and his passive intake pipe and the specific quality of his breathing in the dark on the other side of the partition wall on the coldest nights of the winter. She had not built any of that. It had been built for her or left for her or offered to her by people who had no way of knowing she was coming, who had made their preparations in their small kindnesses and their acts of institutional care with no specific recipient in mind for whoever showed up for the stranger who would eventually need what they had prepared. She had been that stranger. And Joel had been her stranger in the back room of the partition across those winter months. And whoever came next through the fence gap and through the blast door would be someone stranger too. Stepping onto the tile floor she had laid, pressing their palm against the foam board she had glued, sleeping under the ceiling she had insulated and the tarp she had secured, and the earth itself that had been there since before any of them. She folded the note along its crease. She set it back on the dresser. Outside, the rain was doing what the Tacoma rain does when it means it driving in from the sound, in a long, steady curtain, making everything wet and real and present. She could hear it on the window and on the roof above her room, and in the gutters running full. She could feel it in the low-frequency percussion of it, the same frequency she had felt through the concrete of the vault ceiling all those years. The same rain, the same sound, a different room. Her room. Hers in the way that anything is yours when you have committed yourself to learning its specific qualities, when you have decided to know where the water comes slowly and which floor creaks, and how the rain sounds against the glass on the nights it comes in hard from the west. She sat with the rain for a while. Then she got up and went to the dresser and picked up the lantern, the battery-powered LED unit from the liquidation store on South Tacoma Way, the one that had cost $18 and that she had carried out of the bunker as the single object she was not willing to leave behind. She set it on the windowsill and switched it on. The light went everywhere. It found the ceiling and the walls and the floor and spread across them in the warm amber circle that was always wider than you expected, always reaching further than you thought it would reach, finding the edges of the room and making them present and clear. She stood back and looked at it. It was a room.